Order, order. Thank you very much to our witnesses for coming before us. You are our first oral evidence session of this new committee, of this new Parliament, of the Home Affairs Select Committee. So we're very grateful that you've come and very pleased to see you. As you know, we are looking at the policing response to the disorder that we saw in the summer, which affected people up and down the country. And we're very keen to hear from all of you, and we've got a number of questions for you. What I'm going to do is let you introduce yourselves. Then I just have to make a statement regarding sub judice, and then we will get on to questioning. So perhaps Chief Constable Webster.
Mark Webster, I'm the Chief Constable of Cleveland, please.
Okay.
Good afternoon, I'm Lauren Poultney, I'm the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire.
Good afternoon, Chris Noble, the Chief Constable of Staffordshire Police.
Good afternoon, I'm Judi Heaton, Chief Constable of Humberside Police.
Thank you very much. So just for clarity, as members and witnesses will be aware, criminal proceedings are ongoing in relation to events in Southport and against participants in the summer disorder. As such, in line with the House's sub judice resolution, we are not intending to inquire into the specific circumstances of any individual cases. Okay, we'll start the questioning, and we're going to start with a more general questioning around the policing response, and Belle Ribeiro Addy is going to start.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering if you could briefly outline the methods employed in your force's response to the protests and disorder.
Would you like us to go in turn, any particular one?
Order. Why don't you start at the beginning?
Okay.
I'll start in that order, and then we'll go across, yes.
If I start with ourselves then, so we had two specific instances of disorder. The first on the 31st of July, which was 2 days after the Southport attacks, and that was the second major seated disorder in the country. And then we had a second incident a few days after that in Middlesbrough. On both occasions, there was no notification of the police of any formal protest, but what we picked up through community intelligence and social media and neighbourhood policing was an intention on both to partake in what people often refer to as a protest or a vigil, and ostensibly they were both intending to be peaceful on initial pass, at least that's what was described to us. Neither protest had specific organisers, so there was an inability to impose any conditions. And I'll deal with them in general terms. Both were resourced appropriately, ideally in an attempt to facilitate protest, but also with the ability to have a contingency to deal with any disorder if that should happen. So what we had was a facilitative strategy that would allow legitimate and lawful protest, but actually wouldn't tolerate criminality. And both over the course of time, and I can explain in more detail if you should want me to in later questions, both of those descended into disorder, and at that point the policing response obviously changed with the contingency resources that we had. So initially what we set out to do was facilitate protest, but be able to deal with the criminality and disorder should that occur, which indeed of course did occur.
Thank you.
A very similar situation in South Yorkshire. We were notified about 3 days in advance that a protest was due to take place at a hotel where asylum seekers were housed. A command structure was set up, a gold, silver, bronze command, which is the sort of approved professional practice for policing for public order events. The intelligence was assessed, and what was believed to be an appropriate response was put in place, very similar to the account given by my colleague, and an approach that would facilitate peaceful protest and also be able to deal with any disorder that arose as a result.
Good afternoon. So from a Staffordshire perspective, really two significant areas of disorder. The first one on the 3rd of August, which was the Saturday, was in Hanley, which is in Stoke-on-Trent. And really between 11 in the morning until about 12 midnight, we had various ongoing seats of disorder. Probably a little bit different to some of the other areas. We did have some degree of awareness in advance that was going to be, in quotes, a protest. We got the sense very, very quickly it was going to be anything but in terms of lawful and non-violent protest. And there were also a number of altercations and indeed violent episodes between various communities within Hanley as well. In terms of Tamworth, which was the day afterwards, very, very little information. And again, the key period of disorder was from between 7 and half 11 in the evening. And very significant disorder over a number of hours directed at police officers, including petrol bombs, rocks, masonry, fireworks, trees being used to stab at police officers, and indeed having officers having petrol poured on them and attempted to be set on fire. So across both of those seats of disorder, we've now made 187 arrests, with a number more to come.
Good afternoon. Humberside Police were notified on the Tuesday before the disorder that occurred on Saturday, the 3rd of August. Essentially, this was to be a peaceful protest that happened quite routinely in the centre of Hull. The same organiser notified us that they'd had more interest because they put it out on open social media rather than a closed group. They recognised that there were more people attending than normal, and on the back of that and the incident over in the Liverpool area, in Merseyside, we decided that we would also stand up a public order command approach. Normally we would have had 10 to 15 local police officers, but we actually employed the public order approach to that, and like my colleagues, we stood up the full command centre. The protest did actually take place and quite quickly descended into disorder, with missiles being thrown. The disorder moved to outside an asylum seekers hotel, where attempts were made to protest outside there, and then it splintered into various streets in Hull, and it took a while to get under control. I think it was 7 hours in total that we saw disorder. Made numerous arrests along the way, but actually did some mass arrests as well towards the end to quell the disorder, and thankfully it just confined itself to that day.
Thank you. And Chief Constables Noble and Heaton touched particularly on when everything descended into disorder, but I wanted to ask Chief Constables Webster and Poultney when you realised that you got to a point where it was not a demonstration but in fact a riot, and at what point the policing situation changed.
Do you want me to start?
Go on.
So on the day of the protest at the hotel in Manvards, initially the protest went as we anticipated, and it was in accordance with the intelligence that we had. The counter-protesters were on scene first. They started to arrive from about 9:30 in the morning. The main protesters arrived at about 11 o'clock. To start with, everybody kept in the areas that had been identified for them to sort of protest from. After about an hour and a half, the counter-protesters said that they wished to leave. The atmosphere was quite tense, so they decided to leave, which obviously dissipated part of the challenge. They were escorted away by police officers from the scene, leaving just the protesters there, no counter-protest. About the same time, the number of protesters accelerated quite significantly. We went from having about 100 in number to probably about 500 arriving by about 1 in the afternoon, and it was at that point that there were really significant attacks on the police officers that were there without the counter-protesters there to sort of shout and show the frustration to. The protesters very quickly turned their attention to the police officers that were there and the occupants of the hotel.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if I deal with Hartlepool first, in relation to Hartlepool, there were initially there was a post that invited people to come and take part in the vigil. We actually made a couple of proactive arrests very early on of some of the people posting on suspicion of offences involved in inciting racial hatred. So the attempt there obviously was to try to kind of nip things in the bud early on, but those posts had generated significant interest. So what we then had was people coming into Hartlepool, and I'm quite sure some will have wished to take part in a vigil. I'm sure some. That's not what we ended up with. But the numbers started to swell, perhaps 200 or 300 people, and it was clear what we deploy are protest liaison officers who attempt to have conversations with protesters, and many of the 200 or 300 showed no signs of wanting to listen or wanting to engage whatsoever. And then the group started to move towards, there are two sites, one's a mosque, one's a Salam centre. There was a party of kids in the Salam centre who the policing liaison with parents got out of the way, and actually the what had now become a large group of 200 to 300 people were more moving towards the mosque and towards the Salam centre. That was the point at which we made the judgment that this was no longer going to be a vigil or a lawful protest. And at that point, there was a lot of policing resource then put into that. Hartlepool is a little bit like a grid system, lots of houses, lots of diversity within those houses, and actually the grid system and the resources then allowed us to police that effectively. But it became very violent. We had police vehicles set on fire. We had an awful lot of damage to commercial and business premises and residential premises, and we had officers, similar to as Chris has mentioned. We had officers who people were determined to cause serious harm to, bricks thrown at people's heads. There were parts of window frames kind of thrown through the lines and what have you. So that got very violent, and we made a number of arrests. Initially on the night, 8, and then after that, we've subsequently arrested in relation to Hartlepool another 53 people. Middlesbrough was slightly different. Again, we made proactive arrests to try to reduce any potential for disorder. But there was a lot of gathering, and quite early on it was clear that groups were gathering who weren't intent on protest. People with balaclavas and other things, which kind of gave the public order commanders an obvious signal. Numbers there swelled to 1,000, and equally there was a strong police presence there. We made a significant number of arrests on the day. There was lots of damage. There was more fire around there as well, utilised as a weapon. And I think we made 43 arrests on the day, and so far I think 109 so far, with more to come. And again, the level of violence meted out against officers was quite incredible.
And given the level of violence and the threat to life of general public and people in hotels, for example, and mosques, and actually the police themselves, which tactics did you employ, and how did you make the decision to use these tactics? So I'll start the other end for a change.
Thank you. We started out with a low-key approach, because normally our protests or the speeches at the town centre were very peaceful. So we started with that approach, but we had very much over-policed it. We were anticipating that we might need extra resources. So they started out in their standard uniform. And then very, very quickly it became clear, like my colleagues have said, that disorder was going to happen, with missiles being thrown between people originally protesting and then some counter-protesters. And then, as usual, the police end up in the middle of that, and then they become the target. We very quickly ferried out some of the officers to get kitted up into their public order attire, leaving some of the others, and we swiftly did that. And so they were then in their level 2 uniform, which is overalls and their helmet, and then we moved into level 3, which is slightly more robust. That disorder happened from being peaceful and normality to being full-scale disorder in approximately 40 minutes. So it went very quickly.
Thank you.
It can be very context specific, and again, it's from my perspective as a chief constable, it's trying to sort of square the circle of responsibilities to communities, those protesting, and indeed my own staff as well. So there's always a lot of planning in the background about contingencies, resources behind the scenes, officers wearing yellow coats over the top of maybe their so-called riot gear or protective gear. So there's always that thinking in the planning phase. In terms of Hanley, we did have prior knowledge. We had a degree of engagement with the organisers, so therefore we tried to engage with them to get a sense about what this would look like. But whenever it became clear it wasn't going to be a protest, it was disorder, because we have more resources, we were able to engage in a much more dynamic way with both communities involved in disorder. Tamworth, we had very little knowledge, therefore our core priority was to protect the individuals in the hotel, 135 individuals and some staff, which meant that for a number of hours police officers were essentially bearing the brunt of individuals trying to get into that hotel and set fire to it. So until we were able to secure additional resources, we couldn't have the same type of dynamic tactics, making arrests, dispersing the crowd, etc., that we did have in Hanley, so very context specific.
I'll bring Paul Kohler in, just as a question.
Thank you. As things ratchet up and you make decisions to adopt new sort of equipment, riot gear, who makes that decision? Is it going to you, or is it the person on the ground? Who makes that decision?
I can speak for Staffordshire, but it will be pretty consistent across the country, because in terms of how we're trained, accredited, in terms of how we debrief the events, this is the core of sort of UK public order policing. So you will have a bronze commander on the ground, normally will be an inspector who is dealing with what's in front of them, Sometimes they will have to self-authorise, for want of a better phrase, because they've got to keep people safe, and therefore they will direct a change of dress or various tactics. In slightly slower time, you will have an opportunity to engage with a silver commander who's normally removed through radio comms. Then there'll be a plan in place that they will give those bronze commanders a very clear sense about what they want them to achieve and to an extent how. Even further removed, in the strategic space, you've got a gold commander who again will have overview of what's going on and be very thoughtful about what resources are needed, community context, engaging with appropriate political representatives at the right time and setting overall objectives for what they're looking to achieve, with an eye on what's gone before and what may come afterwards as well. So that's the classic response that probably in different degrees will have worked out across our areas.
Yeah, I think it is consistent. I might just add to that as well. I will say, and I think you'd probably expect me to say, the courage and determination of our officers was phenomenal. I had special constables behind shields as well, so not only officers who were being paid to do this, but specials who weren't being paid to do this. But in terms of tactics, police dogs were invaluable in public order situations. I know that my colleague in Staffordshire had instances of offenders trying to break glass and put it under the feet of police dogs, for example. You know, that's a sign of how much they fear the use of police dogs. And drones and other tactics to identify potential offenders later down the line are really valuable. We still have, there's 87 people that we're still working towards arresting and processing, and that ID evidence at the early stage is really value to pursue them later on.
Sean Davis wants to come in.
Clearly, we've heard from all of you about your individual issues and challenges around the riots. Was there any suggestion, or if so, at what point was there any evidence that this was nationally coordinated by the so-called protesters? And if there was there any kind of national sharing of information, tactics and intelligence to support that in a counter sense?
I can take that. At the minute, in terms of sort of a controlling mind or hand behind it, no sense of that on a national level. I think whenever we sort of work through the investigations, as we seize devices, as investigations progress, and obviously we'll be protective of those, it will be interesting to see, even within local areas, what level of control or guidance was there, or essentially was there a mob mentality, a copycatting, people reacting on the day. So what we've seen in Staffordshire is probably a little bit of a mixed bag, with people getting caught up in this, getting involved in violence. No excuse, and they'll be dealt with appropriately. But then other individuals in the background who seem to have more of a role in terms of messaging people, not quite control, but at least a degree of a sense about this was more about disorder than protest. But as yet, I haven't seen any evidence that this was a nationally coordinated set of outbreaks as opposed to more locally events.
Just to follow up, sorry, Chair, just in terms of that kind of sharing of, there might not be, they might not control in mind, but very similar type of protest or disorder. Did you guys work at a national level to sort of share intelligence and techniques and so forth?
Yeah, and if we think back to previous instances of disorder, you had disorder, for example, in Leeds, in Swansea, in Bristol over the last 2 or 3 years, where there's been both debriefs, live time, which are shared across the country, and an opportunity then through the College of Policing for knowledge sharing events, so we can learn vicariously from other areas. That work was done. It's a little bit more challenging in live time where you've got multiple seats of disorder across the country, but in terms of our regional structures, the national structures, and I think you'll get a bit more of a sense of that in January as well, hopefully. There was a sharing of intelligence and an awareness of what was going on, but I think that will be a key area for policing to reflect on. Was it effective enough? Was it quick enough? And then how does it translate into securing more resources to mobilise across the country? So I think that's a key area of exploration for us.
We're going to come on. Ben's going to have questions about intelligence sharing in a moment, but Jake, Richards, and then back to Bell.
Try and be brief. Chief Constable Poultney, I just want to ask about the Mambas Hotel, which obviously in Wath was the big event in South Yorkshire, or the biggest event in South Yorkshire. What assessment did you make as to how many officers were going to be needed in the build-up to that? And how did that change throughout the day? I asked just because a constituent of mine is a police officer, and he told me that he did 20-hour shift that day without any break for food or even to go to the toilet. I just wondered how that assessment is done, how it's reviewed, and what's been done since. And if I may, just briefly to Chief Constable Heaton, colleagues in Humber, have raised a number of issues in response. I think it's just fair to give you the opportunity to perhaps comment on them. They speak of members of the police chief officer group not being in the region during the days leading up to the riots and during the riots, a lack of media comment in the aftermath, that some officers had to use taxis and personal vehicles to get to hospital when they're injured, and they wondered whether there's been an internal review of your forces' response to the riots as well.
So in relation to the planned protest at Rotherham, so an comprehensive intel review was undertaken. All of the intelligence that we had suggested that this was going to be a peaceful protest, and that was what all the social media that we were able to see called for as well. There had been a previous protest in the same location about a year previously, so the template for that, which was policed successfully, was used as a starting point. So we started the day with 2 full PSUs, with protest liaison officers, with non-protected cereals, and with dogs and horses and drones available to us. It very quickly, as the events escalated sort of after 12:30, 1 o'clock, became apparent that that was insufficient for us to be able to maintain safety at the location, and our absolute priority was to protect life, to preserve the life of people there, people inside the hotel. So we put in a request for mutual aid from a number of other forces, and we were able to secure mutual aid, which started to arrive very quickly. Initially it came from West Yorkshire and British Transport Police who were nearby, and as the day progressed it came in from locations further afield as well, but there was obviously a travelling requirement upon them. I'm very conscious that officers worked some really, really long hours, and they were long, hard hours, and they were at significant risk from people who were intent on causing harm to them. I've heard accounts from officers that were there when the building was breached and curtains were set alight. They managed to clear those that had breached outside, back outside again, but remained in the building to keep it safe while it was filled with smoke. There were some incredible acts of bravery that day. I'm incredibly proud of the police officers and the work that they did, and there was some superhuman effort by them. And the tales of people not being able to eat, drink, go to the toilet, absolutely, that was the case. I'm very grateful to a local premise that opened their doors and provided a refuge to officers that gave them food and drink while we got stuff to the front line to them as well.
Very briefly, I know that I've got the chronology right. There were events elsewhere in the country that had become violent on the Friday night, and perhaps even on Thursday. So do you think, on reflection, perhaps more capacity should have been organised from the outset for that Saturday protest?
Just on mutual aid, we will come on to questions specific on mutual aid, so if you can just focus on your own forces.
Knowing what we know now, of course there are things that we would do differently, but based on what we knew at the time, those that devised the command structure were confident that it was the right level. But of course, knowing what we know now, there are clearly things that we would reconsider and potentially do differently.
Constable Heaton, did you want to come in?
So the question was around chief officers being in the region, and they were. Certainly on the lead up, we had the intelligence on the Tuesday. Chief officers were working long and hard around the planning of that. We're around during the weekend. Because of the length of time of the disorder, the Gold Commander, who incidentally isn't a Chief Constable, that was one of our most experienced public order commanders. And then of course we had to change over. That was Chief Officer. That was on the Saturday night. On the Sunday I had 2 chief officers there. I was there. So we were around, and actually we worked continuously for the next 2 to 3 weeks, including weekends. So there were chief officers around. In terms of the media, we did do quite a lot of the media. An assistant chief constable took the lead on that for me. My comms officer sadly was away on holiday, so we had a limited lead for that, but we did do quite a lot of communication during that time. And in terms of taxis and vehicles taking people to hospital, I wasn't aware of that particular issue. I'll certainly take that away and look into it, but the Police Federation were really supportive of our, again, very brave and enduring officers on the front line. So I'll take that away, but the Federation were also very supportive as well, and they're providing water, etc. And we even got into conversations about isotonic drinks and things, because if you'll remember back, that it was a very hot day. So it was really difficult to be kitted up like that for a long time. So the welfare was definitely a primary focus, but when you're in the heat of it, it's really difficult to do everything.
Has there been a formal internal review? Sorry, that was just the last question. Yeah.
Yes, we've had a what is termed a hot debrief, yeah.
Let's go back to Belle.
Thank you, Chair. I know Chief Constable Poultney referred to some incidents a year ago, and Chief Constable Noble some incidents previously in Leeds. I wonder if the other Chief Constables could comment on how the approaches that you adopted during the disorder actually differed to other events that you'd faced.
I think from our perspective, what I would say is we police in Cleveland, in Teesside, a very, very challenged area. There are an awful lot of drivers of social deprivation. We have high levels of crime, and we have kind of we have signal events on occasion, so we'll have very difficult events that will have a greater impact on the community. We had a terrorist-inspired murder within the 12 months prior to our disorder. So all of those factors are considered in terms of what we call a community impact assessment, which is refreshed regularly as to how does this feel? You know, how does this feel to the neighbourhood police in Leeds? What is the tension, the indicators, the mood? Are any of these signal events likely to need to be input into any policing operation or any response to disorder? So that's quite a comprehensive process. That took place in both areas prior to the disorder, in one of them a day prior and in others a few days prior. There were no indicators in that this was likely to be, or any of those factors are likely to indicate tension that would lead to this level of disorder. So I certainly think in regard to Hartlepool, the planning was appropriate. There was no indication that in that spontaneous event there were kind of signals prior to that this was likely to happen. So hence that then informs the policing approach and informs the policing approach to facilitating legitimate protest. And then equally in Middlesbrough, whilst that came a few days after, and there was, I think as Chris maybe referred to as copycat incidents across the country, all of that is considered then in terms of the policing response. So what you saw in the policing response in Middlesbrough was very quickly, when that turned to criminality and disorder, you saw a very proactive arrest strategy. You saw a lot more arrests. You saw drones up. You saw the police helicopter up identifying people, mapping clothing for future investigation. So I guess we always learn from what goes before, and we assess what kind of incidents may be feeding the mood of a community prior to any operational planning.
Okay, and Chief Constable Heaton, how does it compare to other public order policing events?
Certainly in Humberside, we've not had anything at all, ever, and hopefully never again. In terms of the intelligence, as I said earlier, it was intended that it was going to be peaceful. That's what we anticipated, but in light of the tension nationally and the issues in Merseyside, it was clear that there was the potential for it to escalate, and so we put extra resources in, as described earlier, but we've never had anything like this.
And you've all referred to protests, and even I've referred to protests, and we continue to refer to protests, but it became very clear very quickly to the public that it wasn't a peaceful demonstration, and the riots were quite racist in their rhetoric and xenophobic. And I suppose I wanted to get a grasp on when they first broke out, how wary were you of the violence, given that obviously we all knew the incident that sparked it, and the police seem to, in your different areas, I think you touched on this, Chief Constable Heaton, were able to come or have their gear ready to be able to respond to that kind of incident. So I suppose just trying to get a grasp on how soon you knew and how prepared you were for that, because it seems you were quite prepared, even though the premise seems to be it was going to be peaceful.
Maybe if I can talk generically initially, and then colleagues can come in locally. I think one of the big challenges around policing, public order and public safety is how you strike a balance and how you remain proportionate in your response. And there is case law, statute law about making sure that even in the planning phase, you're always planning to minimise the use of force. So that is baked into the policing mindset around the approach. And so in terms of engagement with key individuals, whether it be protest or that's a veil for something much more sinister than that, there will always be an attempt where we possibly can to have conversations and engage, involve police liaison teams, community engagement, etc., etc. But even though there were some indications in Staffordshire, even days before, that there may well be the potential for violence at some of these incidents. We cannot prejudge that and automatically apply force at the start. We have to deal with what's in front of us and ensure then we're very flexible to respond, which is why officers may be wearing protective gear underneath yellow coats. It's just us being thoughtful about not sending out any cues, which again on occasions may well actually provoke disorder. So as to a particular spark, very, very difficult to say. Sometimes it can just be stones being thrown at the police or across community boundaries and areas, and then it can degenerate from there. It can be, even post-event, whenever we've got the benefit of looking at things in slower time, still difficult to identify one event. What I would say is now elements like social media have probably become very significant in the last 5, 6 to 7 years, where whenever we were dealing with the 2011 riots and disorder, which is different to what we've been dealing with, whilst you had BlackBerry Messenger, for example, in play, and there was a sharing of information, nowhere near as dynamic, wasn't encrypted, wasn't the ability to go viral. So I had an individual who was tweeting from the account of Tommy Robinson, who tweeted something about a number of British white males having been assaulted by a number of Asian males. 4.8 million views. We responded to that in 8 minutes to clarify it hadn't happened, and we need to make sure that we can speak with that level of authority and accuracy. But that is a dynamic which can both generate disorder and prolong disorder, which is relatively new in terms of the challenges we're facing.
I'd like to move us on to other topics, if that's okay, but there will be
one question on the law.
Yeah, you go quickly on that
one. Were the powers that you had sufficient to deal with the disorder that you found yourself with, and did you utilise any of the new powers under the Policing Crime Sentencing Courts Act or the Public Order Act?
We use Section 60 quite extensively. The powers, there were no powers out there that I think we were calling for that we didn't have access to.
So no use of any of the new powers?
In relation to the recent powers, for example, around protest policing?
Yeah.
They may well have been considered at the very start in terms of what we were dealing with, and but this was disorder and ultimately riot on some occasions, so the powers would have been very different from considerations around protest policing, which is where the vast majority of recent legislative changes have taken place.
Thank you. We did touch on intelligence sharing, but Ben Maguire's got a question on that.
Thanks, Chair. Question, I guess, to all of you, and I've just got one or two follow-ups to this one as well, is how easily you were able to share intelligence about suspects with other forces, both during and after the disorder?
I think, so we, forces are brigaded in regions usually in terms of support. So if I talk about the northeast region that at least three of us are from, sorry Chris, we're all really reasonably familiar with each other. Our staff work together, they often train together, and as to the conduits, the kind of intelligence functions there know each other. So in terms of regional intelligence sharing, that works well. I'm quite sure Chris is unlikely to say anything otherwise about his region. We also have regional organised crime units, and we have the National Crime Agency too. So depending on what intelligence support we need, for example, if we've got people overseas who we believe are posted on social media, a different part of that apparatus will support us in that work. My view on that is it works well. Some of it is quite complex, certainly with social media. If you're trying to work out who somebody is and where they may be, some of that work is more complex and maybe is slightly slower than intelligence sharing within your own force area, but it works. I see people bent over backwards to help and to support. Probably the one thing that I think does need a bit of reflection on is the narrative about what this was and what was going on. Because certainly in the early days, I attended one or two national meetings, and the conversation was about right-wing people maybe being whipped up, maybe a control in mind, and this was about people travelling on trains, restricting travel because they were coming into areas and fomenting violence. That was not what I saw. The vast majority, in fact almost universally, everybody arrested in 169 arrests, they're all Teessiders. You know, the furthest they hailed from was Darlington, which is probably 12 miles away, and they were people who lived in Teesside and who'd managed to kind of, you know, extend their horizons to Darlington. So this wasn't people coming in from outside. And I think maybe in the early days of this disorder, you know, there's a lot of coverage in the media about what this was, but I think the disorder in each and every area was different, and it certainly didn't fit that narrative where it was happening for me.
I suppose further to that, just going on the communication between ourselves, that's kind of our role in this. So our gold commanders are not us, but we were engaging in quite a lot of national meetings throughout on an almost daily basis, and obviously sharing what had happened, what was going to happen, and just sort of sharing the whole context operationally that we were all involved in. And also we all had our own intelligence cells set up, and they were all communicating as well at a regional and national basis, on a regional and national basis as well.
Thanks for that. You mentioned, or Chief Constable Mark Webster, you mentioned about analysing the intelligence that was shared. Obviously you have your systems for sharing it, but it seems like the most time-consuming and resource-consuming issue would be the actual analysing of that intelligence. And certainly we've got some notes here. The Met Police Commissioner mentioned that thousands of hours of footage from body-worn video, CCTV and social media was scoured to identify some of the suspects. And similarly, you mentioned before about looking through social media, TikTok and other platforms to identify suspects, but that seems like a huge kind of use of time. Are you resourced well enough to do that?
It is a huge resource of time, but I guess, you know, policing is all about any decision we make is kind of a decision to take resource away from elsewhere. Of course, more resource is always helpful, isn't it? But we have to make those prioritisation decisions every day. It was really important to us very early on to be very proactive in terms of arrest, to try to reduce the chance of further disorder, and to very rapidly lay hands on people that we could identify and put them into the criminal justice system. So we did. We had a very big team doing that early on. I think we were arresting large numbers of people, particularly when you consider the size of the force, which is a smaller force. But very quickly we got people put through the criminal justice system. I will say the courts and the CPS was superb. If you want to see a real priority, this was a real priority, and the speed and the support we got was excellent. I sat in court for a day's sentencing, watching these people go through within a week of the disorder, and it was good to be able to see that whole team come together. So yes, it is a lot of work. It's a lot of time to go through footage, and my officers are still doing that today. You know, we've reduced the number in that team because, of course, we've got lots of other business to do around all sorts of different risky areas of policing. But we will pursue each and every offender that we can identify, and we will seek to identify everybody we can attribute a criminal act to. That will take some time, but we think it's absolutely necessary to do that. Just briefly, and I'll finish. Sometimes you can speed some of that up, so facial recognition technology using the police national database and things like that, but much of it is manual detective work.
Paul Kohler, very quickly.
On the real-time monitoring of social media, is that all done from within your forces, or do you get outside help from GCHQ or anyone like that, other agencies?
In terms of what we're dealing with, there are thresholds in terms of what policing can deal with and how intrusive we can be. Again, speaking from a Staffordshire point of view, we were very aware that there were closed groups, whether it be WhatsApp, Facebook, Telegram, where people were sharing information. Now, on occasions, individuals very helpfully for us screenshotted that and shared them on other forums, so we were able to appropriately see what was going on. And obviously, we don't take that as gospel. We still have to verify and check that. So there are a degree of constraints for us in live time in terms of what we can see. But there are technologies and mechanisms and capabilities where we can get a sense of what's going on in terms of analysis around sentiment and community tensions. But there are lots of false positives in that environment. And if we reacted to everything that social media said was going to happen, I'm not sure what else we would deliver apart from looking for the next violent disorder incident or indeed protest. So we have to be judicious. And as Mark says, human beings ultimately need to make judgments, not technologies.
Are you doing it internally? Are you getting help from outside agencies, or is it just you within each force?
We've got capabilities internally, and as appropriate, there will be other organisations that can help us from different parts of the policing network as well. And of course, local authorities also have that ability and capability to understand community cohesions and tensions. So I think it is important that it's broader than just a policing look at what is going on online within communities as well. But we do have those capabilities, yes.
Very keen to move us on to the next section, but Belle has one very quick question, and then I'll bring on Robbie.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that you have the capabilities, but I suppose, do you have the resources and the training to be able to monitor something that's moving that fast-paced on social media, your police forces?
I think it's fair to say it's incredibly challenging and resource intensive. This spread of things on social media is just massive. And one of the big challenges for us was we would see the same message getting played out on different forums, but each of those was having to be researched individually and actually then drawn back to the same point of commonality and understand actually it's the same thing that's coming out as from something else. So the amount of resourcing around that is really significant, and it is something that was challenging to keep on top of in these circumstances. We did use social media effectively after the disorder. We issued 180 images of people that had taken part in the disorder on our social media challenges, and were really overwhelmed by the public support in naming some of those involved as well. So I think it's just fair to say that there were some real positives to us in using the social media as well.
I'm keen to move on to the impact on neighbourhood policing and other priorities. I've got Robbie Moore, then Sean Davis, and then Margaret Mullane. So Robbie.
Yeah, so thank you all for your time, much appreciated. So I'm very keen to focus on the financial pressures that each of your forces will have experienced. So maybe I could ask just all of you just to dig into that a little bit, and also explain when answering what that means in terms of other policing pressures that you have when you have obviously whether it's a riot or the pressures that we saw over the summer come to the forefront. Okay. So, yeah, if you don't mind, and maybe if I go over to the other side of the table and then...
Okay, so our assessment of what this has cost the force, bear in mind this is purely police numbers at the moment, what this has cost the force so far is £705,000, our force. Bear in mind, we're a small force, we're probably around 1% of policing, but £705,000. Now, there were letters of comfort issued early on to make sure there wasn't any delay getting people out of the door and cancelling rest days and leave, and there was an awful lot of that went on. We still don't know what percentage of that will be reimbursed, but if it isn't all reimbursed, that will have an impact on force funding. There was also, I'm aware, under the Right Compensation Act, most PCCs went out and asked for people to submit claims for maybe uninsured damage. For some reason, we had a number of claims within Cleveland. One was of particularly high value. They totalled 416,000, but because nationally the aggregate value across all force areas was fairly low, I think the answer that my Police and Crime Commissioner has got is that won't be reimbursed. Now, that is significant because, of course, it's his budget, but he disperses his budget primarily to the police force and for other commission services. So if that comes out of the overall budget, again, that will have an impact on the force.
Thank you. And just maybe just expand on two of the points there that you made, and I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything additional, but just in terms of the reimbursement factor, obviously you've got no control when within the calendar year protests are necessarily happening, but the financial budget will be set at a particular time of the year. Yeah. What stage would you feel it is normal for reimbursement decisions to be taken? And therefore, then when are you making decisions around when the impact will be on other policing priorities that you would be dealing with?
Yeah, a good question. I'm trying to hear my CFO telling me the answers to that in my ear, but I can pretty much predict what he would say is we will need to know that in time to adjust any future annual budget cycle or medium-term financial plans. So we're in December now. There isn't an awful lot more time before we could make any necessary adjustments, I think, before next year.
Chief Constable Heaton, is there anything you want to add, or in addition to what's already been said, I suspect?
I could give you my numbers if you wish.
Please do. Yeah.
Okay, so the total cost to Humberside Police stands currently at £493,000. If we get reimbursed under current arrangements at 85%, our shortfall will be £137,000. 100,000 or nearly 138. Our claims for premises damaged, etc., that my colleague has alluded to, ours stand at 226,000 at the minute. That's for 8 premises. There are a further 2 potential premises who may lay claim. And so obviously if we get the reimbursement and so the shortfall plus the claim, which again the Police and Crime Commissioner at the moment is picking up the cost for, that will set us back £355,000. So it's not insubstantial, and again will impact on next year's budget if it comes for next year. Our financial year ends like the tax year, so April.
Yeah. Okay. And just may I also ask about shift patterns as well? So when you're making decisions around the allocation of resource during the peak period of a protest or beyond that, if you wouldn't mind just expanding on the financial pressures when making decisions around shift patterns.
Okay, so we cancelled rest days, and we had a lot of people who were volunteering to come in as well. So, for instance, our HR team at the weekend just came in to our main stations to meet and greet staff when they came off the front line, which was amazing. So we basically paid rest days. We didn't cancel leave. We didn't get to that point, but obviously we would have done that had we needed to.
There are different timelines within the police regulations. So if you are cancelling rest days with less than 5 days notice, the individual is compensated at a greater rate than if they get more than 5 days notice. So the less notice you have, the more expensive it is. And if you are doing something as intrusive as cancelling somebody's annual leave, it becomes more expensive again.
And is there anything that Chief Constable Noble you want to add on the financials? Because I'm just keen, and does the same apply in terms of decisions around reimbursement? I assume it does to all 4.
Hopefully, we'll see what emerge. We've all put our requirements in against the sort of rules that have been applied, so we're very hopeful that will be done in as timely a manner as possible, because the reality is that we're having to pause investment decisions right now, as in people, in terms of employing additional officers or staff. I've got a budget gap in 25-26 of £7 million already. The significant outlay we've already spent, not just in the immediate response, but over the next 18 months will be very, very significant. And if there isn't that sort of effective opportunity to reimburse policing, will then service levels to communities will have to shift and change, whether that be neighbourhood policing, proactive policing, tackling organised crime, working in partnerships. So appreciate we're talking in the money element. In some ways that's relatively easy captured. The consequences around communities and indeed inside policing organisations will be very significant, because we didn't have this capacity sitting latent in policing at all. This is all spend that we just did not have, and we would much rather been able to apply, if we ever did have it, elsewhere as well. So financial, human and community costs will be very significant over the next 18 months at least.
Mm-hmm. I just want to, my next question will come on to the human element of it, but just Chief Constable Poultney, was there anything on the financials that you wanted to specifically raise?
Our claim that's been lodged is around, we think we spent about £750,000. Okay. The mutual aid costs on the day of the disorder alone was over £100,000.
Okay, so I know my colleague's going to ask about the special grant, so I won't go there. But what I would like to just delve into is a little bit is the impact on people throughout the summer, and the impact on the workforce in terms of resilience with the with your teams. I don't know if you want to just give a bit of an overview of negative implications potentially that the summer period has had on the workforce internally, and how you're allocating that force outwards.
I'll be brief then. So we had 20 officers injured, most thankfully minor injuries. We had one more serious. We had an officer who had a heart attack during the middle of the disorder. That was serious, but he's not back at work, but he's recovering. We provided support, welfare support. We were there on duty through the night, like many of the officers didn't go home. There was occupational health staff there. We had debriefs You know, we made sure people were fed, watered, looked after. There was a very happy pizza establishment that had £1,000 worth of pizza ordered, you know, which we were looking after our staff to make sure we made sure that they could eat and drink and what have you. So actually on the day there were injuries, there were bumps, there were bruises, there was a serious injury, but there was welfare support to debrief. I know that was very much appreciated by the staff themselves and by the Federation. There will likely be cases of kind of recurrent trauma at some point. You know, when you're an officer and somebody's throwing bricks at your head, determined to try to cause you some damage, you know, that will be an interesting policing experience. But, you know, we've got the support and mechanisms in place to try to support that. On the positive, because there is a positive side to that, the sense of esprit de corps and camaraderie was phenomenal. It really was phenomenal. We had officers who had done 14, 16 hours, had been pelted with missiles, who'd go home and then turn around and come back within an hour and a half because they couldn't leave their colleagues facing that. We had people cancelling holidays, people coming in on the birthday, we had all sorts of stuff. So there was equally, out of a terrible situation, a really positive kick as well in terms of morale and boost for the force.
And this isn't aimed at anyone in particular, but you did mention the implications of trauma as well as those real negative implications that would have been dealt with by some forces. And I know in the written evidence that the committee received, some forces specifically highlighted that. And actually, Jake has also referenced it in some earlier questioning. Just expand a little bit on what are you starting to do, if anything yet, in terms of specific lessons to be learned around some of those colleagues of yours that will have identified more anxiety that's associated with now those sorts of experiences, more trauma-related circumstances in terms of going forward?
There were a number of actions that we took place immediately after the disorder. So we have a trauma-informed process that we ensured people were flagged to. We did some welfare and wellbeing roadshows across the force to give people the opportunity to speak to somebody from occupational health, to speak to a counsellor. We took chaplains with us, effectively just giving people an opportunity to have a conversation with people that could listen to them. And there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of sadness, there was a lot of frustration. And I absolutely share with my colleague the concerns about long-term psychological impact that this may have and the impact that might have on our workforce in the future. I have brought with me for each of the committee members a copy of our Force Wellbeing magazine. We did a special edition after the events. There were some stories in there, people sharing it, sharing their experiences and how they're recovering, and some information about the sort of wellbeing provision that's in place. And that's just really to give you a bit of the context from a very sort of people-focused approach. In terms of a more formal debrief, we're undertaking a formal debrief currently across both our planning, the operation on the day, and things subsequently such as the welfare provision. We're doing that with assistance from the College of Policing, and we'll ensure that any lessons that we learn are adopted from there. There was something raised a week or so afterwards that perhaps we'd gone too early with some of the wellbeing roadshows. We were really keen to get out and talk to people and let them know that these things were in place for them. And then it came back, well, actually, that might have been better waiting for a week to give it time for people to sink in. I think the police treatment centres opened their doors to people that weren't necessarily sort of paying members for that. And I think we're all really grateful for the support that they've given to help our officers recuperate. We had 67 officers from South Yorkshire injured on the day. We had a number of broken bones, concussion, officers knocked out due to having sort of missiles to the head. So that, you know, this was, you know, a serious day where officers were under significant threat.
Okay, thank you. And just, was there anything additional that's not really been said?
Just very briefly.
Yeah.
Normally, whenever I prepare for committees like this, your key audience is the public. For me, in many ways today, it's actually my own staff. So we've shared the link in advance, and hopefully they'll get a chance to watch this and get a sense about the balance of support and challenge around policing in these really critical events. But again, 35 officers injured. And actually 35 families impacted as well as just the officers themselves. Day-to-day policing, we invest a huge amount around well-being, resilience, supporting officers debrief. For events like this, it's very, very difficult to prepare for. It's very often your best is a much more tailored response. But the health service were outstanding. One of my officers who were injured said that, Burton General Hospital, in terms of what they did, humbled him beyond any event in his life. So I think the health service stepped up, as well as us as employers stepping up as well, and really made a massive difference around those initial recoveries. But for some officers, this will change them for the rest of their lives, and they will live with the implications of it for the rest of their lives as well.
I'm very conscious that we really only strictly have you for another 5 minutes. I hope we can impose on you a little bit longer, because we do have quite a lot of questions we still want to ask. And I want to bring Margaret Mullane in on abstractions and impact on other policing priorities.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered generally how significant you all feel abstractions within your force during the disorder, with particularly what did the effect did the abstractions have on neighbourhood policing, and how were you able, if you were, able to mitigate the impact of the adverse effects?
One of the things that we undertook to try and mitigate the impact, and it had an impact on the officers themselves, was we had to extend people's working days. So we put everybody onto 12-hour shifts instead of 8 or 10-hour shifts. And bear in mind, people had already been at the front line of disorder or dealing with the events peripheral to it. They were then coming back to work for extended periods of time over the next sort of few days. It was really important that we maintained our neighbourhood policing activity and actually really invigorated it in relation to, and that wasn't just in the specific area where the disorder had happened. It was across the force area, because clearly the community unease went much further than that single site at that period in time. So for us, the answer was in extending the working hours of our officers who had already worked long extended hours and hard hours at that. And I'm really grateful to them for them doing that, because that really did enable us to maintain business as usual across the force area, because what we couldn't do was allow this to impact on that.
So if I could just come back, so that those officers that stepped up and did those hours, would they get the hours back? Would they get that paid? They would get paid. And the level of abstractions you didn't feel as you were coming into this affected it, all of you?
Well, our public order trained officers aren't, they have day jobs. We pull them out of those day jobs in order to staff public order events. So when we were notified of the protest taking place, we had to at that point cancel rest days for everybody across the force to be able to provide the public order response as well as maintain business as usual. So really the cost and impact of it has been amongst those officers, who many of them went for a couple of weeks without a day off, worked really long hours during the summer holiday period for many of them as well.
I think just to add, similar situation, although we will owe some staff for cancelled leave and things like that which won't be paid, and as we work through the next year or 18 months, there'll be the odd day where this officer isn't on duty because they're using one of these rest days accrued. So there will be a kind of slow tail of impact in terms of people using up those days. In terms of maybe, at the height we had 320 people policing the disorder in Middlesbrough. Every one of those officers will have a normal day job, and it's not public order policing. There'll be detectives, there'll be community officers, there'll be all sorts of things. Many of those officers will have a caseload of 15, 18, 20 cases. So all of that will have been impacted on to a degree, and there is an inevitability around that. So in terms of going out looking for our suspects that we've identified, we're prioritising those who we know have a criminal, are criminally active and are likely to cause harm. So if one of our offenders, for example, is a repeat domestic violence offender, we'll prioritise them and go and get them to make sure that we kind of mitigate some of those delays that may have occurred because of the police and disorder. It's very difficult to quantify that, because if you've got 320 officers each carrying 15 or 20 caseloads, each one would be impacted to a degree. All you can speak about really is in general terms, there will be an impact on maybe the speed of justice on some of the other activity.
So do you feel that, all of you now, that where you're following up, you mentioned earlier you're still following up and you've had to cut back that team, that kind of thing as well, do you think that will have an impact as well?
It won't have an impact in terms of anybody we can identify and locate will face justice, so that will happen. But we need, we have lots of knife crime in our area, we have lots of violence against women and girls and what have you, so we constantly need to make a judgment as to where that resource balance is, to make sure that we deal with it on a basis of harm and immediacy and urgency. And I guess in policing we're all making those decisions every day.
Okay. Anyone else want to add anything else?
We managed to avoid a lot of abstraction actually from our neighbourhood teams. We backfilled it with some overtime. to make sure that people were on the ground, given the importance of that local connection during that time, particularly for people who felt vulnerable, so people who were seeking asylum, all those sorts of communities, and including our own staff as well felt affected by it. But just going back to the other question as well that Mr Moore raised about injuries, etc., we only had 12 people injured in terms of our police officers, mostly bumps and bruises, I'm thankful to say. One person had to have stitches, but much like the colleagues described earlier, they returned to work very quickly, and one or two of them that I spoke to actually said it's okay to be okay as well. So not everybody's traumatised who was involved. That I think it's important to note that as well.
Thank you. So I want to move on to the political response, and we've got questions from Paul Kohler, Jake Richards and Sean Davis. So Paul.
I just have a quick question on abstractions. Are you all saying that the policing of this, abstractions, insofar as they happened, didn't really affect neighbourhood policing? Because that's not my experience in London, where abstractions have a huge effect on neighbourhood policing. Now, is that because London is different, or...?
No, sorry, to clarify, that certainly wasn't what I said. Many of these officers will have come from neighbourhood posts to police the disorder. So I think there will be, but of course, this also has had a positive effect in terms of showing communities that we are supporting and protecting them. So I don't think it's a binary, this was good or this was bad, but there will have been some abstraction from some of those functions, as well as the CID and traffic departments and everybody else.
I think in the very short term, you can change your approach around your response policing to generate some additional officers who can step into the breach and minimise the amount of neighbourhood abstractions. But over a period of time, they may well then have to cover some of those shifts in response policing. So it's difficult to track. But in the short term, neighbourhood policing is never more important than whenever you've got tension within communities. So we'll do all we can to try and protect that.
Thank you. Now moving on to the political aspect. Now, the government announced that there was daily meetings between the Home Office and senior police officers. What was your input to that? Were you aware of that? Were you part of that? And how helpful was that process?
I had a call from the Home Secretary the day after the disorder, just to see how we were and how it had gone, and did we have what we needed. And I also had a visit from the Policing Minister the Friday after the disorder, prior to the second weekend.
I think very similar levels of interest, as well as from local MPs and elected representatives as well, in terms of showing support for policing and seeing what they can do to assist, as well as being thoughtful about their role in the recovery phase and what happens after the immediate heat of the disorder settles.
Very similar political interest after the event from the Home Secretary, and a visit from the Deputy Prime Minister, who came and met a number of officers that were involved on the day. I think the meetings were attended by those who are likely to come in January, the national meetings between police representatives and members of the government.
So it was care and support rather than what you need at the moment. We're dealing with it. Is everything okay, rather?
I think there were appropriate levels of intrusion as well in terms of what the policing response looked like. How might it shape and form? What's the early learning, which is quite appropriate to have. But again, I suspect probably panel members in January who are probably more directly involved in those conversations would probably be better placed to answer that.
Thank you.
Jake.
There's been a lot of talk about two-tier policing in and around these riots over the summer. Firstly, what effect has that phenomenon had on your force and your officers? And also, how does it make you feel for accomplished police officers?
Well, that's difficult to respond to that last comment, but in terms of the officers you've got in front of you, well, I suppose I heard the term nearly 15 years ago in Northern Ireland in terms of the inter-community dynamics there, which I'm careful how I boil that down, but very often it was about one side feeling another side was being better treated than they were. And again, from a policing point of view, there and here, it does not make any sense for policing at all to show favouritism whenever we're built on respect for the rule of the law and an integrity and approach. So it's difficult to take, but on the other hand, you also need to work with the perception, even if the facts aren't there. What I would say in terms of what we're dealing with here, this is a very different set of circumstances from the very complex rights and balances we need to strike around protest policing. This is dealing with thugs and criminals who are trying to kill police officers, set fire to buildings and commit serious criminal offences. So if two-tier policing is bringing people swiftly to justice, I'm not quite sure many people would argue with that. The final point I would make is we're part of a criminal justice system with checks and balances. So even if there's a right to challenge a policing decision, which there is, the CPS are intimately involved, the courts are involved, and clearly, committees like yourselves, the IOPC and HMI, CFRS, will have a scrutiny role to play to validate those perceptions one way or another. So it's not nice to hear, but we've got relatively thick skin, but very, very protective of the integrity of our officers in terms of the investigations they're conducting.
I'd support everything Chris says. I'd probably stick my neck out a little bit and say I think it's really unhelpful sometimes. And I go so far to say sometimes it's nonsense, and it does tend to undermine. So we have arrested 169 people. We've charged 91, 32 remanded in custody, 28 sentenced, 5 not yet charged. About a fifth of those were juveniles, so below 18. 79% were white, that's 96 of them. We've got 14 Asian offenders. We've still got outstanding suspects, 49 white, 17 Asian, 2 black. An Asian offender was sentenced yesterday to just under 3 years for stamping on somebody's head for an offence of violent disorder. So the numbers and the proportions there represent what happened on the streets. And without fear or favour, if you were involved in criminality, you were arrested or you will be arrested. The difficulty with the narrative is those are the facts, but people don't necessarily want to listen to the facts. And if it doesn't conform with the view that you want to put across and you want to accuse policing of two-tier policing, it does have a really negative effect on my officers.
I think that's all very fair. You spoke about the CPS and the expeditious, and on that issue, although you're right, bringing criminals swiftly to justice should be applauded, but clearly from some in the public, they're seeing this look like special treatment. How can the government, or all of us and you, do a better job at explaining this in these circumstances?
And that's really difficult because we do and we try, but of course that message doesn't necessarily get traction. Factual debate doesn't seem to be a way through countering some of this argument. So I think that's a difficult question for me to answer. We are very fair in our policing style. If you look at our stop search data, for example, there's no disproportionality in that. We're representative of our communities. But it's difficult when something snowballs and almost gains a life of its own, so the perception of two-tier policing. The people we arrested are the people who there was clear evidence had committed violent disorder or other criminality. And that's what my officers did, So they are the facts. How we counter the narrative is really quite difficult. One of the things we pushed constantly through our communications was please check what you're reading on social media before you act. Please check before you act. Because there were many instances of a standing resource up to respond to something that actually in reality what wasn't something tangible, it wasn't a likely event, it was something that had been whipped up. And actually that media literacy and ability to challenge what you're told and wonder who is that and why are they telling me and what's their motive and is it somebody I've heard of before, is it reputable, that isn't often there, and that is quite a challenge.
I think part of it as well was being able to nip this in the bud, for want of a better phrase. We couldn't have a situation where nationally we were facing disorder like this day in, day out, week in, week out. So actually the swift justice happening and being seen to happen was really important.
Awesome. And just in terms of going forward, what is there a strategy, or obviously there's thought, but is there coherent thought going into how to counter this unfair?
Yeah, I think for me this is actually where the committee's work is really valuable for us, and we've seen that in a number of areas where committees across government have been incredibly valuable about bringing in the evidence, questioning that, validating that, testing it, and then presenting a very clear report. So I think policing has a key role, but there is an element of, well, you would say that anyway, wouldn't you, type of response to it. So I think the advocates and critics of policing, especially those with no axes to grind, it's focused on community benefit, are going to have the loudest voices, whether it be locally or indeed whether it be on a national level in terms of the work that you do. So whatever product emerges from the conversations you have, I think will feed the debate, hopefully in a very evidence-based and influential way.
Yeah, very quickly,
very
and then
quickly.
Ben wants to come in quickly, and then it's Sean.
Just on a sort of a micro issue as part of this, in social media, where a lot of this evolves. I mean, what does forgive me if this is a naive question, but does every force have like a social media strategy and is, you know, you have a communications team, and is this part of their brief? Sorry, that's a silly question, but.
So we certainly have a corporate communications team which has an outward focus on social media. On the day of the disorder, we had a communications officer within the command suite looking at what was coming in, as well as putting out the right messages for us as well. So I think that's pretty embedded across forces.
Thanks, Chair. It seems pretty clear to me from the evidence you've given today that you've got an enormous amount on your plate, and talking about managing narratives without getting too political. Is there not more of a role for the PCCs surely to play here, where they can help you with that narrative and that public-facing piece? Because it doesn't seem like you guys have got time to be politicians, but you've got this elected official. Is there a role for them that they could perhaps take on more of this burden from you?
We will be asking them this in January.
Okay, I better go first then. So I think myself and Mr. Adams have had this conversation both in, let's call it peacetime, as opposed to maybe times of sort of crisis and challenge. And he's very respectful of my role, especially whenever you're dealing with live operational incidents with potentially criminal justice investigations and tales to follow as well. But I do think there is a key role in terms of working with partners, voices into communities, engagements with elected representatives. But I think there's a partnership, and I think there's that healthy respect for each other's roles and responsibilities. But I see it very valuable, and I think those early conversations between chiefs, commissioners, and indeed the wider elected representatives in a local area are very important in terms, because words carry weight and consequence.
John Davis.
Just mindful of time, just in terms of the national policing structure. So in this evidence session we've heard about each individual force looking at social media companies and social media engagement and so forth, and subjective judgments about when there's a protest, when it goes into violent disorder. What is the role of the national policing infrastructure around this? Would it not be better for a national body to have those engagements with social media companies? Would it not be better for a national body to be doing the horizon scanning on social media? Would it be better to have a national force or body that can deploy public order officers into individual areas? It's really helpful for your insights and views on that.
I think so. Each agency or each body will, I guess, have a take or an interest in social media for a particular purpose. So I've worked in Greater Manchester Police, I've worked in the National Crime Agency, Cumbria, and now Cleveland, and each one has its own capability to look at things on social media. None of them have the capability to police the entirety of social media, clearly. You know, these entities are far, far bigger than anything policing's got to offer. But actually, I wouldn't want a national body being the response I need to go to find out about some social media issue on the streets of Hartlepool. I need that to be local, I need it to be really quick, and I need it to be informed by my operational people on the ground. So I need something locally to be able to do that, but equally I need to be able to go to others for that wider support. So, you know, Chris mentioned earlier about the kind of tiered structure. I've got an interest in a number of people who posted things online who may be overseas in relation to the disorder, because I think they've committed criminal offences. So of course I will go up that chain to find the right people who can help me with the right thing. So I think you have got a coordinated structure there. You know, I'm sure that will come up in January, and it'd be interesting to see whether people at the national level have got different views. But I would hate that to be taken away from me, so a national body owns that, but I actually need it today or tomorrow or in 2 hours for local policing on the streets of Middlesbrough.
I think it's really important that you're able to interpret it using your own sort of force context and your regional surroundings. So I think there's a risk at that all being done at a national level.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, I suppose, UK policing's greatest strength is it's very local, its greatest challenge is it's very local. So I think there is definitely lessons for us to reflect on in terms of this disorder, but also how we approach serious and organised crime, counter-terrorism, about what's the right balance about what we do once nationally to provide that consistent approach, and then what do we deliver locally, because we know local people, and clearly your local elected representatives, as well as having national responsibilities, want a local feel, people who get their local area, who they see, who they can rely on, who respond to their local needs. So I think that is core to the debate here about if we need a shift, how do we make sure it's a cautious one and a thoughtful one, as opposed to stepping away from a model which I think still is one that is envied the world over around that local feel and approach to policing.
Yeah, I just think the whole internet space is in need of some attention in general. I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you.
Words.
just very, very quickly, just in terms of the balance between what is a protest and what isn't a protest, particularly where and it's been mentioned in the evidence session, where initially, locally, it looked like it was a protest, but nationally, other things going on. Do you think that we've got the balance right in this country in terms of deciding what is a legitimate protest and what is just thugs using protests as an excuse to bring their supporters onto the streets time and time again to cause chaos and disturbance to communities and use it as a vehicle for other means?
I'll briefly put my other hat on. I tried to hide it until now, but I'm the police chief's lead for protest across the country, and for me, the balance is set by legislators or the judiciary around what is protest and what isn't. I think what we were dealing with over the last, in August specifically, was very clearly violence. And that very clearly shifts the pendulum away from protest, because protest may well have a degree of resistance, but it should be non-violent, and that's where those relevant rights around protest are disengaged, because we're dealing with violent behaviour. So I think the law is clear, but in terms of, for example, the life cycle of activity in a town centre, about when does it move from protest to violent disorder, there can be a period of blurred lines, but all I can say is from a Staffordshire point of view, it became very clear when it wasn't a protest.
I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that, but I just want very fine. I mean, clearly there's a threshold test there, but even low-level antisocial behaviour during a protest, which is multiple times across a year, might not necessarily tip into the threshold of violent disorder. But is it legitimate protest in your view? And do you feel that you have the ability to sort of push back as chief constables in your local area?
Yeah, I think there's a much wider debate there around, acceptable protest activity and levels of tolerance that the law and communities should accept, and I think that's a whole session in itself. So I still think there is a challenge for police commanders on the ground to weigh up some very, very challenging sets of circumstances. When do they intervene? When do they remove people from a road? When do people get arrested for particular offences? So I still think, irrespective of how precise the law is, because of ECHR considerations, there will always be interpretation at the time, which of course are scrutinised in court in slower time. We don't have the ability to apply slow time to policing. We've got to make judgments at the time on the basis of the facts we have.
Belle and Ben want to come in. I realise we are imposing on you, but I hope that's okay.
Yeah, no, so just as we're coming to an end, in the interest of making sure this doesn't happen again, what do you think was behind the riots?
There's a question. I'm going to try and swerve your question, but what I will say is it's pretty clear that when you look at the locations where this disorder occurred, there are probably some common factors among many of them. Many of them are challenged communities. The social fabric is quite difficult across many of those, and I think that probably makes them fairly fertile to be either whipped up or for violence, maybe out of just wanton criminality, boredom, any number of different issues. I sat in court for a full day seeing some of the individuals being sentenced, and most of the people who came through Teesside Crown Court on the first day of sentencing had been out, they'd had too much to drink, they'd walked past and thought, why not? Take from that's not a representative sample, but I think much of that desperation, despair, lack of hope, lack of stake, nothing to lose, I think much of that certainly impacted on the riots that or the disorder that took place in Cleveland.
And do you want to put your question?
Yeah, it's just a quick follow-up actually to Sean's question. In terms of it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier in terms of intelligence sharing and monitoring. In terms of the border between peaceful protest and when it turns into violent disorder, in terms of kind of preemptive arrests and preemptive monitoring of suspects, it's a very sort of open-ended question, but I guess how do you balance that, especially when you don't know how it's going to develop? It's a fast-moving situation. It can quite quickly go from peaceful protest to violent disorder.
So, Chris is the expert and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the judgments that were made, certainly with ours, were you need to make a judgment as to whether you can engage with these people to effect some kind of influence over what's going to happen. If actually during the course of that, as happened in our occasions, those individuals appear to be trip over into criminality, then a judgment was made by my commanders at that point that actually arresting them is maybe going to give us an ability to reduce the risk in relation to that process. But they're very experienced, they're very good. You know, they may make a different judgment on a different day with different weather, with different numbers on the street. You know, they've kind of got that nous and that experience to make that judgment. So I think you can never codify that and say, if this, then you will. There's got to be a lot of experience in that judgment, and they took those judgments at the time, I think. You know, unfortunately, they didn't nip it in the bud, as you might want, but, you know, the difficult balance is you could actually go in and aggravate a situation, and that's the decision, and that's the balance that they've got to judge every time.
I think where we've seen those preemptive arrests taking place, for example, some of the G20s or the climate change conferences, where there's very clear information, very clear intention as what's going to happen. There's a threshold breached. Police can then intervene. We've seen it recently as well with a group called Palestine Action, whenever policing again has been proactive in its approach around arrests. But we need to be very proportionate around that, because it should not be about locking people up who are saying something that people may well find offensive. It's got to be very clearly based in law and process before we do it. But it is a tactic we'll use, but it's very much linked to the levels of harm that might be caused.
And in addition to that, in our case in Hull, the organiser of the protest cooperates with the police. They've had similar protests and speeches in Hull city centre before and since that have been peaceful. So it's not easy to preempt.
Well, I thank you for your time. One final point. So if there's anything else any of you want to add, please, this is your opportunity. We have just about beaten a division bell, which we think is coming any moment. But if there's any reforms you think there could be to the national policing system that could assist in these circumstances, any thoughts you might have on that, and as I say, anything else you might want to say before we conclude? I'll stop in the order we started.
Not particularly. I think if there's anything that comes to mind, I'll write to the panel maybe afterwards, but nothing above what I've said today.
Thank you.
I think just going back a few questions, and it's about the two-tier policing approach. A really fantastic example for me of that is how we don't do business. So on the day of the disorder in Rotherham, I had 2 officers in a van trying to get to colleagues who were injured, and that van was surrounded by protesters who were rocking it from side to side, and they had to make a decision about how they were going to get out of there. And part of their decision-making process was, actually, if this van goes over, it's the protesters that are going to get hurt. So actually they were thinking really broadly about the protesters and protecting their lives as well as those of the residents of the hotel as well. So I just think that was a very sort of proper example of it in actual time.
Thank you.
I think in 30 seconds from me, I think the opportunity to look at what policing did is really valuable. We welcome that. There'll not be any arrogance or defensiveness around what we can learn and do better. But I think, as colleagues have touched on, what happens before and what happens after are fundamental around that community cohesion, understanding our communities and what some of the drivers are. And that's not excusing behaviours. It's recognising that going forwards, we have communities where there's significant tensions and fractures, and we need to be thoughtful about how we address that.
Right.
I'd echo that comment really around the cohesion going forwards. We still have members of the community who are frightened by all of this, or at least the perceptions around some of the anger that was involved. Okay, we saw violent disorder, but the anger was very raw with some of those people, and they still feel that, and that's something we have to work really hard on for a long time to come.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your time. I realise we have, as I say, we have gone longer than we told you we were going, but we have beaten a division bell, so that is something. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, committee. And with that, I will conclude the proceedings. Order, order.